He claimed the voices told him to do it, but those voices were his own, echoing in a mind twisted by darkness. By the time Jason Massey was caught, 14 women had vanished, leaving behind a trail of terror in East Texas. But his sadistic acts didn't stop there. Before the women, Massey tortured animals, dogs, cats, even small pets, using them as practice for his cruelty. What appeared to be a quiet, unremarkable mechanic was in truth a monster lurking within the community. This is the chilling story of Jason Massey, a man whose depravity knew no bounds.
The summer of 2001 in Tyler, Texas began like any other, hot, humid, and mostly quiet. But soon, an unsettling pattern began to emerge. It started with the disappearance of 24-year-old Victoria Owens, a nurse who had worked a late shift at the local hospital. She was last seen walking to her car, but by morning, she was gone. Then, 21-year-old Emily Foster, a student, vanished while jogging near her apartment complex. Days passed without a trace, and soon it became clear that something far more sinister was happening. The disappearances continued to mount, each one more chilling than the last. Women in their 20s, all seemingly ordinary, started vanishing without explanation. They had no obvious connection to one another, but they shared one horrific detail. All were young, female, and last seen within a 30-mile radius of the same highway. Tyler was a close-knit town, a place where people could walk down the street and be greeted by name. But as the weeks stretched on, the fear crept into every corner of the community. No one could ignore the rising tension, especially as news of more women missing or, worse, found dead spread. Despite the growing alarm, the police were no closer to an answer. In the midst of it all, Jason Massey, a 32-year-old mechanic who lived just outside of town, kept to himself. He wasn't a frequent face at local bars or coffee shops. In fact, he was known for being solitary, spending his time working on cars and rarely engaging with anyone. To the people around him, he was simply another unremarkable figure, someone who didn't attract much attention. However, behind closed doors, Massey was far from ordinary. His violent tendencies had started long before he targeted women. Over the years, neighbors and friends began to notice that Massey had a troubling relationship with animals. His backyard was often the site of strange sounds, dogs barking, cats mewing in distress, followed by silence. But no one ever questioned him. Massey kept his dark habits concealed, even as he secretly tortured and killed small animals. Dogs and cats, easy targets, became his practice victims, objects of his growing cruelty. The brutal way he treated them, a reflection of the violence simmering beneath his quiet exterior, was only the beginning. As the number of disappearances grew, Massey's sickening obsession escalated. No one knew then that the same man who had been quietly blending into the town's fabric was preparing to unleash his darkest impulses. The town of Tyler had no idea that their worst nightmare was already walking among them.
Then came the disappearance of Ashley Sanders, a 29-year-old teacher. Ashley was last seen leaving a friend's house late one evening, but her car was found abandoned just a few miles from Massey's home. The police were perplexed. Nothing seemed to connect the victims, aside from their age, gender, and proximity to the highway. Yet there was an unmistakable pattern. Each woman had disappeared without any sign of struggle. No ransom notes, no witnesses.
Massey's ability to blend in with the community allowed him to keep his activities concealed. He wasn't known for being overly friendly, but he was certainly known for being quiet and unremarkable. No one questioned the man who worked on cars all day and rarely left his home in the evenings. In fact, some of his neighbors considered him to be somewhat of a loner, a man with little interest in mingling. But that was the very thing that made him so dangerous. Jason Massey lived among them, and no one knew what he was capable of. For the women who vanished, their lives were more than statistics or names on a missing persons report. They were daughters, sisters, and friends. They had futures, dreams, and the potential to change the world around them. Victoria Owens had plans to marry her longtime boyfriend. Emily Foster had aspirations of becoming a pediatric nurse. Ashley Sanders had just received her master's degree in education and was planning to travel abroad to teach children in underserved communities. All of their hopes were extinguished far too soon, victims of a monster hidden in plain sight. As more women disappeared, the fear grew, but it wasn't until the body of Ashley Sanders was found in an abandoned warehouse near the outskirts of Tyler that the authorities began to see the gravity of what they were dealing with. The discovery of her body marked a turning point. Something darker than they had ever anticipated was unfolding in their small town. Each new victim seemed to confirm what the police had begun to suspect. This wasn't a random spree of disappearances. This was a methodical, calculated predator, and his grip on Tyler was tightening. But who was the man behind it all? And why had he chosen these women? For now, the police had no answers, only more questions, and no idea that they were closer to uncovering a far chilling truth about the person who was terrorizing their town. The pattern was undeniable now. The police could no longer dismiss the disappearances as isolated incidents. Tyler, Texas was dealing with something far darker, and the growing pile of missing persons reports was the grim proof. Investigators had little to go on, no witnesses, no DNA, and no suspects. The fear that had gripped the town only deepened as more women were reported missing, but the police didn't have any real leads, until, that is, Ashley Sanders' body was discovered. The body was found in a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of Tyler, an area that had long been abandoned. The discovery sent shockwaves through the small town, and the media descended quickly. The scene was grotesque. Ashley's body showed signs of brutal torture, and it was clear she had been carefully posed. It was a chilling display of dominance and control. This wasn't just a random murder. It was the work of someone who was relishing in the power they held over their victims. Forensic investigators combed the scene, collecting evidence that would later prove to be crucial. They found DNA that didn't match any of the victims, and though they had no immediate match, it was enough to give them hope. The missing link had been found, but it would be some time before it would connect the dots between the victims and their killer. At first, the police thought the bodies had been disposed of hastily, maybe by someone who was trying to avoid being caught. But then they realized the opposite was true. The careful, methodical nature of the killings, the way the bodies were positioned, the way the crime scenes were staged, suggested something far more calculated. The killer wasn't just trying to evade detection, he was playing a twisted game, and it was becoming more clear that Jason Massey, with his quiet demeanor and isolated life, was playing a role in it all. As police began to connect the dots, it became apparent that the disappearances were all centered around one part of town. Investigators pored over the area near Massey's home, tracing his movements, looking for any sign that he might be involved. But he seemed completely unremarkable. A man with no criminal record, no history of violent behavior. To the outside world, Massey was just another man keeping to himself and working on cars. Yet the closer they looked, the more troubling the inconsistencies became. Massey's routine began to raise suspicion. He had been known to take long walks in the areas where the bodies were found. He also frequented local spots where women had been seen just before their disappearances. He was always alone, and he never seemed to interact much with others, which made him the perfect predator. Still, there wasn't enough concrete evidence to bring him in for questioning. But the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. It was just a matter of time before the investigation took a sharper turn. Little did the police know, they were closing in on a man who had been hiding in plain sight, blending in so well that no one suspected him of the horrors he had already committed. The discovery of Ashley Sanders' body had opened a door, but it was clear the path to capturing the killer would be far from easy. They were no longer just chasing down a faceless predator. They were hunting a man who knew the community, who had become part of its fabric, and whose dark secrets were buried deep beneath the surface. Massey's background was anything but ordinary. Born and raised in a small town just outside of Tyler, he had grown up in an environment marked by neglect and abuse. His parents were distant and disconnected, rarely offering affection or guidance. By the time Massey reached his teenage years, he had begun to show signs of a disturbed mind. Friends and family recalled instances of cruelty towards animals, behavior that was often brushed off as just a phase. But it was far more than that. Massey's first known acts of violence were against the family pets: dogs, cats, and even rabbits. Neighbors had often heard strange noises coming from his house late at night, barking dogs, cries of animals in distress, followed by silence. Massey didn't just kill the animals, he tortured them, using them to satisfy his growing appetite for control and power. His acts were often cruel, calculated, and disturbing. He would later claim that these animals were training for something bigger, but at the time, no one suspected the true extent of his depravity. As he grew older, his disturbing behavior became more pronounced. He never held a steady job for long, but when he did, he worked as a mechanic in Tyler, living a life of isolation. He didn't maintain close friendships, nor did he have any significant relationships. His social interactions were limited, allowing him to carefully construct a persona of an ordinary, harmless man. Yet his obsession with control and his escalating violence began to find new outlets, first in the torture of animals, and eventually in the brutal killings of women. While the women he targeted were seemingly unrelated, he carefully selected them, learning their routines and movements. He didn't need to be charming or charismatic, he simply needed to observe. He was an expert in playing the part of an invisible man in his community, someone who could move through the world unnoticed, all the while indulging in his darkest urges. His cold, calculating nature made him an even chillier figure. There was no sign of remorse or empathy for the lives he destroyed. He was a predator, and his victims were nothing more than objects to be used and discarded. In many ways, he had already proven that he was capable of anything. It wasn't just about killing. It was about exerting control, about asserting his dominance over those he saw as weak. At first, investigators had no clue just how far Massey's depravity reached. But as they dug deeper into his background, the pieces began to fit together. The small-town mechanic, the quiet loner, the man who kept to himself, he was exactly what the police were looking for. The more they learned, the more they realized that Jason Massey had been hiding his monstrous tendencies behind a mask of normalcy. And now, with a growing body count, it seemed that mask was beginning to crack. It was only a matter of time before they would catch up to him. The evidence was mounting, and the net was closing in. The monster behind the mask was about to be exposed. But before that could happen, Massey was already planning his next move. As the police dug deeper into Jason Massey's life and the victims he had left behind, they began to uncover the horrifying consistency of his method. What was once believed to be a series of random disappearances was now unmistakably a pattern, marked by the deliberate, calculated approach of a man who seemed to have studied the art of murder like a craft. Massey's killings were not impulsive, they were methodical, each one executed with chilling precision. He didn't just kill for the sake of killing, he killed for control. Each victim was a carefully chosen participant in a macabre ritual. Massey often stalked his victims for days, learning their routines, watching from the shadows. He understood their vulnerabilities, and he exploited them. It was clear that Massey wasn't just picking women at random, he was selecting them based on his own twisted criteria. The first signs of his modus operandi were subtle. He would follow the women, lingering just out of sight, learning their habits, mapping their movements. Once he had an understanding of where they would be and when, he would strike. The killings were often planned to coincide with a moment when the victim would be most vulnerable, late at night when they were walking alone or in isolated areas where no one would hear them scream. Massey relied on his quiet, unassuming presence to keep his victims unaware of the danger until it was too late. His signature was clear: suffocation. At first, the investigators believed it was a coincidence, but as more bodies were discovered, the pattern became undeniable. Massey would suffocate his victims using a variety of methods: strangulation with his bare hands, a rope, or even a piece of clothing. He wasn't in a hurry, he wanted them to suffer. He would often watch as their bodies struggled for air, enjoying the control he had over life and death. But the suffocation was just the beginning. After he killed them, Massey would pose their bodies in a ritualistic manner, often placing them in positions that seemed to suggest something dark, almost symbolic. Some victims had their arms raised as though in surrender. Others were arranged to face the sky, as though staring into the void. These post-mortem rituals were more than just his need for control. They were his attempt to communicate something with the world. It was as though he was sending a message, one that no one had yet deciphered. Over time, Massey became more brazen. His killings escalated in brutality, with each murder more gruesome than the last. It was as though he was testing his own limits, seeing how far he could push the boundaries of his sadistic pleasure. He no longer tried to hide the bodies. In fact, he seemed to want them found. The bodies were discovered in increasingly public places, often left in areas where he knew they would be discovered quickly. It was as if he wanted the world to witness his work, to see the terror he had caused. The thrill of the kill, it seemed, was not enough for him anymore. He craved the attention, the notoriety. The police began to see a distinct escalation in the nature of the killings, but even with this growing body of evidence, they were no closer to finding Massey. The more violent his acts became, the more difficult it was to pin him down. Each time they thought they were closing in on a suspect, they were met with frustration. Massey was a ghost, elusive, unpredictable, and always one step ahead. But it wasn't just his crimes that were escalating, it was his confidence. Massey, who had once lived in the shadows, now felt invincible. With each new killing, he grew more audacious, as if daring the police to catch him. And yet, he was always careful to cover his tracks, to erase every trace of evidence that might lead back to him. He wasn't just a killer. He was a predator, and he was playing a game that no one seemed to understand. As the killings grew in frequency and brutality, the fear in Tyler deepened. People were no longer just worried about disappearing, they were terrified of the very idea that anyone could be next. The killer was among them, watching, waiting, and they had no idea who he was. By the time the police had gathered enough evidence to focus their attention on Jason Massey, the body count had risen, and the town of Tyler was in a state of constant fear. Detectives had grown more desperate. Each lead seemed to go nowhere, and each time they thought they had a break in the case, they were left with more questions. But then a breakthrough came in the form of surveillance footage from a nearby gas station. One of the victims, Ashley Sanders, had been seen on the gas station's security camera just hours before she disappeared. She had been walking alone, carrying a bag, when a figure appeared in the background. The footage was grainy, but it was enough to identify Massey's vehicle, a rusted, unmistakable truck he had been known to drive. The police, eager to follow up, began to trace Massey's whereabouts. What they didn't know was that Massey had been tracking their every move with equal diligence. The breakthrough wasn't just in the footage, it was in the DNA. A small sample of blood found on one of the victims matched a sample that was secretly taken from Massey after a routine traffic stop months earlier. It was a mistake on his part, but it gave investigators the key piece of evidence they needed to link him to the crimes. With the pieces finally coming together, the police knew they were closing in on the killer, but they had to move fast before Massey could disappear again. On a cool autumn evening, Jason Massey was arrested without resistance at his home on the outskirts of Tyler. The arrest was almost anticlimactic. He didn't fight back, didn't show any emotion as the officers swarmed his property. When he was taken into custody, Massey remained eerily calm, as though he had been expecting this moment for some time. His arrest came after weeks of surveillance, with the evidence mounting against him. At first, Massey denied any involvement in the murders, claiming that he was innocent and that the evidence was circumstantial. But the police were ready. They had DNA evidence, the surveillance footage, and witness testimony linking him to the victims. When confronted with the evidence, Massey's demeanor shifted slightly, but he never broke. His cold, methodical nature remained intact. In the following days, the town of Tyler was left in shock as the full extent of his crimes came to light. During his interrogation, Massey revealed little about his motivations. He claimed that he wasn't driven by a need for money or revenge, he simply had to do it. His lack of remorse sent chills down the spines of those who spoke with him. He showed no signs of fear or guilt, making it clear that he had never seen his actions as wrong. The trial was a media spectacle, with the small town of Tyler watching in disbelief as the man they once saw as ordinary was revealed to be a monster. His conviction seemed inevitable. Jason Massey was convicted on all charges, sentenced to life in prison without parole. His trial revealed the chilling depths of his indifference, as he showed no remorse for the lives he destroyed. For the town of Tyler, the conviction brought some closure, but the pain lingered for the victims' families. They would never forget the man who had once walked among them, hidden in plain sight. The community slowly began to heal, but the shadow of Massey's crimes would never fully fade. If you found this story haunting, subscribe for more gripping true crime cases.